Coming up next, what are we reading, Brandon?
Emma.
By who, Brandon?
J.A. herself.
J.A., and what does that stand for?
Jane Austen.
Jane Austen, the woman, the womith, the...
Texas named their capital after her.
Is that why they named it Austin?
I think so.
Hey, hello, folks. Welcome to the Bookening. My name is Nathan Alberson, your humble, obedient, and very quiet host. I'm also sucking on a menthol cough drop right now because this episode's kind of weird that we all have sore throats. Brandon's a pre-diabetic.
I don't have a sore throat. I just can't avoid sugar. We've already established that.
We've already established that. Jake had the mother of all frogs in his throat, which he has before on the podcast. But this time, we just wanted to, in 2017, we wanted to bring you some extra quality. And so that's what we're doing.
We're going NPR style now.
Yeah, exactly. We're just going to talk like hipsters that just smoked a bunch of pot.
This is Brandon Chastain. I'm going to tell you about Emma.
Welcome to the podcast, folks. Welcome to our first episode of Austen Month here. But Austen Month is a prized month for me because I love Jane Austen. It's a prized month for Brandon. I think brings a tear to his eye because of his home state, which is, of course, Brandon,
Texas,
and the capital of Texas,
Austin. And we've established they named it after Jane Austen.
Yep.
Misspelled it, though, because they're Texans.
Yep.
That's right.
If you could see the disgusting look of Brandon on Brandon's face. Folks, we're recording this late again, just like we always do lately, but we're going to bring you some quality discussion of Jane Austen, and I know we are because we're joined by two wonderful people and myself. But the two wonderful people are... Oh, and I do want to apologize for last week's episode where I said that Howl was by Jack Kerouac. I said
Did you?
Howl was... Yeah. I was trying to make a crummy joke, and I was trying to pull it real fast, and so I pulled it, and I said Howl by Kerouac, and it worked, but I was a little ashamed. Howl is, of course, by Ginsberg.
Yes.
So I apologize for that.
You idiot.
I know all. I just wanted to avoid the letters and emails, guys.
They're already starting to pour in.
I knew our fans would be angry at me. They come to this quality for podcasts, guys. Anyway, I'm joined. I bring the podcast. The people that bring the quality, there's two of them. One and then two. Number one, I call him Jake Menzel. Pastor Jake Menzel. He's the pastor
That's
who's a
what
master.
my parents call me.
Thing one and thing two.
Thing one and thing two. Your parents call you Jake Menzel. Well, following your parents' lead, I call you Jake Menzel. And I welcome you to Austen Month, Jake.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm excited to be here, to be a part of Austen Month. I, too, am a Jane Austen fan.
And we are also joined by, I'm hoping, another Austen fan. We'll find out here in a second when I ask him. His name is Brandon Chastain, PhD, ABD.
Yeah, I'm an Austen fan, and you're wonderful, too.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
Me and Jane Austen are like on the top of your list.
Yeah.
Made for each other.
Yeah. I do think that me and Jane Austen are made for each other. And if she's listening, if she's crawled out of
From
that
beyond
grave.
the grave.
Yeah. You know what I realized didn't happen at all during our last two episodes, the poetry episodes, was Brendan pull... I just burped.
Brandon Pool.
Brendan didn't pull out those pistols and fire them off and say yee-haw and give us some context.
Did I not?
For the poetry? No, I don't think so.
Okay.
So you probably should.
Oh, yeah.
What happened to your guns, man?
They're not shooting. They're rusty. Oh, I think they're rusty because we've already shot these shells before.
Oh, yes?
Yeah, my gun knows. It's been used on Austen before.
That's true. One of the Bookening rules is that we have to reuse shells.
For any author that we've...
For any author that we're coming back
I thought you were
to.
just going to say it's been rusty because it's been a couple episodes since you've used them. But
And it's also been a couple episodes, except for when I have gone down to the border to help out Trump.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Every Texan has been called back. Building that wall, baby.
Building that wall, baby. Making America Great Again.
Oh, yeah. Forget that.
In any case, it's contextual text, and Brandon is, in fact, wearing a red Make America Great hat. He's firing off his pistols right now. He's going to make America great by introducing us to another classic work of literature. Now, Brandon has already talked about Jane Austen, before in our Pride and Prejudice in our Pride and Prejudice episode, which you can listen to. Very first episode we did. We were green at the time, but since then we've become amazing. In any case, if you want to hear some stuff about Austen, that's a good place to start. But Brandon, what do you want to say about Emma and Jane Austen and all that good stuff?
Well, I don't think it would hurt to recap a few things about Jane Austen.
I think it would hurt at all. In fact, it would be very pleasant.
Would it?
And I hope that you do.
Well, as we all know, Jane Austen is most famous for being Nathan's favorite authoress.
Definitely.
Or maybe author.
Authoress. Maybe favorite author. I love her.
To position her where she is now that we've had a whole year of novels and we've just talked about poetry, where she is she's right at the kind of the birth of the novel as a form, right at the end of the 1700s. She's in what's considered to be kind of a classical period of literature. Not a lot of experiment with form, a lot of craft for craft's sake. So probably right before her would be Alexander Pope, and he's really known for just being a craftsman with poetry, and she's very similar to that. She's a craftswoman. She's not really doing a lot of the experimentation you're going to see with poetry just around the corner. I mean, the Romantics wouldn't be too much long after her. In fact, they were kind of writing right as she was nearing the end of her career. So that's important because a lot of people admire Jane Austen, and I don't think we talked about this a lot last time, but they admire Jane Austen for just the form and the craft of her novels, for how beautifully structured they are, and yet how artless it seems at times too, because the narrative doesn't seem to be as meticulously detailed as it actually is. And so
they were admired for that.
Oh, she's admired for that, yeah. She'll take these themes and these ideas and she'll weave them throughout the novel. So you have Pride and Prejudice. The famous one is Pride and Prejudice become the theme of that novel. But if you think of Emma, very early on, what I was thinking of is very early on, Mr. Knightley says that he thought that it would be good for her to one day have heartbreak and to understand, and then she would mature. And then that's what happens throughout the novel. You don't really realize that's playing out with Churchill, but it does. And so she just uses these things, but it doesn't seem like Mr. Knightley's just pausing and telling you a plot point. Like I said, it seems artless, and yet it's there. And if you go back and look at the form of her novels and the way that they take shape and the way that they play out, it really is, it's amazing. And with Emma, you have the 3 acts, and each act plays out, I think it's 3 parts, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so in each act plays its essential role, and it takes a very sort of classical structure and approach to telling the story. And yet what's, I guess, maybe groundbreaking about her, or at least unique about her, is the way that she has so much insight, Shakespearean insight into character. She brought this not just potboiler fiction, but fiction that was both driving towards a plot and an end. That very Aristotelian sense of needing to have action, and the action take you somewhere, and it unravels, and but also a focus on the characters and the characters' insights. And so her narrative style, and I think we touched on this with the other summary of Austen, but her narrative style, this third-person indirect style that she has, where at one point she's telling the story, but then suddenly you'll be from the perspective of the character. This is actually pretty revolutionary as far as the novel goes, because it opens up the way that an author can play with tone. And so at one point Jane Austen, can be telling us the story, but then suddenly it's actually from Emma's perspective, and it shifts without us really realizing it's shifting.
A lot of times in the novel, it'll be set off by, just so people know where to look for it, it'll be set off by dashes and exclamation points. It'll have things like, what a blunder, or what a terrible mistake that had been, will suddenly be in her thoughts, but it won't be in italics, it won't be in quotation marks. Austen will just freely move back and forth between Emma's point of view and the omniscient narrator's point of view, in a way where sometimes you're not even quite sure which one is being represented.
Yeah, or just take any paragraph. Like, contrary to the usual course of things, Mr. Elton's wanting to pay his addresses to her had sunk him in her opinion. His professions and his proposals did him no service. And so what's really fun and intriguing about Austen is that it gets to the point where you don't know if Austen's telling us these things as fact, or if it's also colored by Emma's understanding of things too. Mm-hmm. And so, like, She thought nothing of his attachment and was insulted by his hopes. He wanted to marry well, and having the arrogance to raise his eyes to her, pretended to be in love. So right there, you don't know, is that Austen telling us that he had that arrogance, or is this Emma thinking that he had this arrogance? And then it's just...
And she really does play with that. You see that in Pride and Prejudice, how we actually get, for the first half of the novel, Lizzie's perspective, and Darcy is presented to us as somebody who's cold and proud and nasty. And it's not until Lizzie has her revelation, the letter comes, that we get to see a bigger picture of what's actually going on with Darcy as a reader, because her narrative style is so intermixed with Lizzie, and we see the same kinds of things happen.
Yeah, so probably one of the clearest points in this novel is when she's trying to convince Harriet that Elton is in love with her, and her confusions, and we know what's going on, but Emma has no clue. And those what seems to be omniscient narratives are actually then mixed in with Emma's thoughts. And it, like I said, it allows for a lot of flexibility with the narrative style. Would be adopted by novelists for up till today, really. People are still doing this.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that as a modern reader, it was revolutionary for its time, and you do not notice it at all because you're simply just used to it in modern novels. I mean, you read really any modern novel, and they'll do that all the time, where they're shifting points of view, giving you the author's perspective, but not, or rather giving you the character's perspective, but it's from third person. It's not set off in quotation marks. It's not, put in a little thought bubble. It's just, you read any random potboiler from the supermarket now, and you'll see, Jack Reacher looked around the corner. It was very suspicious looking, whatever. I'm not a good enough writer to come up with an amazing Jack Reacher scene, but that sort of thing is just ubiquitous in most fiction now, certainly in most of the 20th century fiction that we read, but it was not ubiquitous in Austen's time. And
yeah, so go through her novel and try to find where she says she thought or she pondered or any of these things, and she doesn't use those sort of...
You do see that. I mean, you'll get like a monologue in quotes, like where you do get direct thought, but then a lot of it will be, like you said, just Mr. Elton's arrogance, and you don't really know whether that's the omniscient narrator, and Austen's kind of dancing into Emma's head and then dancing out of it.
Yeah, and so the value of that is it immerses you more in the world. Like we've said with Shakespeare, you can be immersed in a Shakespeare play, but you're reading a play, and it really comes to life when you can be immersed in his world by watching it on stage. And that's kind of what she's able to do with her novel, is bring it to life for you. So you feel like you're both in their thoughts, but also watching it happen. And so you get the wonders of it all. So she was doing this, and then in the late 1800s, and then after her, the novel would take off. You would get the Romantic period, and then you'd get Dickens, and everything would change. We talked a lot about who she was last time. She was her status in society was she was the daughter of a country gentleman. And I think it's useful to go back over the hierarchical nature of British society at the time, because it's all over Emma. Really, where you were born in life was where you were meant to stay in life. Education was built around it. Your available options for marriage and also for a job, that was built around it. And so you could be born into the gentility, or you could be born into the peasantry, and there really wasn't much mobility beyond that. Then, of course, even within, and we saw this is very similar to what you see in Anna Karenina with Tolstoy. Even when you get into the gentility, there's hierarchy within that. And so you have your nobles who are around the court, and I don't think we ever really see anybody like that with Jane Austen's characters, do we? Well, I guess Lady Catherine? Yeah, from Pride and Prejudice is the closest we ever get to that. So Darcy, to an extent, would have been that. So you have your nobility who are around the court, then you have your landed gentry, and even below them you have sort of your country squires and not pastors, but parsons, what would they have called them? Clergymen, yeah. There we go. And so they all have their ranks, and they all have their positions. Then beneath them, you would have your schoolmasters, your governesses, your merchants. It was all sort of shifting and changing at this time, which makes it mildly interesting. Your merchants were beginning to become a new sort of landed gentry because of their money.
Is that like the governess's husband, Mr.
Weston?
Mr. Weston.
Yeah, Mr. Weston is very much that. Mm-hmm. And so they made their money, and he also married into money. But the merchant class was really beginning to change sort of this gentry model. But It was still there. And then you also had your soldiers. Then beneath them, you had your working class. And you had hierarchy even there. But the thing is you weren't meant to or expected to go from one class to another. And that's very much the comedy of Emma, is she thinks that Harriet Smith really should. She was born into the working class, and yet she thinks that she deserves to be better than she is.
When she has to create a myth about Harriet in order to justify it in her own mind. Surely she was actually born of a gentleman's daughter, and everybody knows that couldn't possibly be the case. But she has to convince herself of that in order to convince herself that Harriet belongs in her sphere.
But then you do have some flexibility with the Westons, with Jane Fairfax.
Yeah, I was about to say. But you do see some
with Frank Churchill, even in a weird way. I don't know.
Yeah, and what's it based on? It's largely based on beauty and also character. So what Knightley keeps saying about Harriet, and though he changes his opinion somewhat of her, is that she just doesn't have
the chops.
Yeah, the chops. She doesn't have the personality or the character that Jane Fairfax has.
She doesn't have the class.
She doesn't have the class, yeah.
He matches her with, who's it?
Roger Martin.
Mr. Martin.
But there he sort of, at least at the beginning of the novel, says that Roger Martin's much better than she deserves. Even she'd be doing well to get Roger Martin.
Yeah, well, he clearly thinks very highly of Mr. Martin in his place and sphere.
And so the novel is playing around with these ideas of sphere and expectations. And so we see it with Jane very clearly, because she has the option of either marrying Frank Churchill, which will be an improvement in her station, even though we kind of get the sense that she was raised, who were her benefactors?
I forget their names.
But they were wealthy, and they, right?
But it was seen as a tragedy that she would be raised by this compassionate family of benefactors who were then going to have to basically sell her into slavery because there was nothing else that they can do.
And so the novel also shows us the options that women had versus men. And so obviously a lot of critics today pick up on that and run with it. And they had the option to either marry or become a governess. And becoming a governess, even though you were a governess usually for a gentry family, you would not be seen as gentry. You were a governess. That would mark your position in society. That's who you would be. You would be the governess.
You might be loved. They might treat you well. A little bit like Mammy in the South, kind of.
Or you might end up being the object of, like, the French governess in Anna Karenina, right? Which is a trope for a reason.
Right.
It happened. And also, what's the famous? Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre. However you say it. And so, and being a governess was by no means an improvement in your position. And so that helps understand why Jane isn't excited about the option and why it seems to her to be kind of selling out there at the end if she has to do this. And it says a lot about Mrs. Elton, too, that this is what she's trying to push Jane into. So those were the options. And
I should point out that Jane Austen herself did a third option, which was she did not marry, and she relied on the support of her brothers and her family. And I think perhaps had a little bit of Miss Bates experience in that things went downhill. I think she started out better than she ended.
I think that's true.
But she was always, she always had family and enough to eat and all that sort of thing. But yeah, she wasn't going to go out and get a job at McDonald's. She.
The world was closed to women, and it was just awful. It was a dark time. That glass
That's the
ceiling.
Star Wars scroll at the beginning of
it was a dark time
for women.
The glass ceiling was not just unbroken.
The glass ceiling was...
The world was a glass ceiling. I don't know.
Poor Jane had to live in a world of virtuous men who would allow her to care for her nieces and nephews and write her books and never have to worry about her living, instead of allowing her to go out and get a job. And
I know.
Poor Jane, she just had to write the 6 greatest novels.
Man, it's just awful.
Language,
They treated her like a woman.
Yeah.
Man, that's awful. So
she didn't even have a place of her own.
No, room of her own.
Right.
I know.
Had to write in the room with her nephews, annoying her, and
it's awful.
But hey, even without a room of her own, she learned to write like 100 times better than Virginia Woolf ever did.
Think of how much greater her insight into human nature would be if she had been allowed to go out and work at McDonald's.
I think I stole your thunder. Sorry.
Did you say that?
No, I said she wrote 100 times better than Virginia Woolf ever did.
Right. That's okay.
I'm a Virginia Woolf hater.
I think we can stake the Bookening's claim as a not
/ misogynist.
Yeah,
yeah, we're misogynists.
Yeah.
And we love Jane Austen, but good grief, Virginia Woolf, what were you up to?
We love Jane Austen.
We love ladies.
Right.
Yeah, we love ladies.
The old-fashioned lady.
We're ladies, men.
Right, yes.
That then brings us to one other point about society at the time that's probably useful to understand the situation of education at the time. Primary schools, they existed. They weren't there for just everyone. But you had these schools that were largely based, it came out of usually Christian charities, would be set up in small rural towns.
Like Harriet's boarding school.
Yeah, that's what I was getting towards. Yeah. So Harriet's boarding school would have been one of these. And so Harriet, she had no known father or mother, was brought there as an orphan, but she was raised, and they had a school mistress who taught them the practical things that they needed to know and nothing more. And that was fine. For those who were in the right spheres, you would have the college. You could go to college, or for women, and even for some young men, you could hire a governess to come in and teach. Wealthier families could hire like a French governess or someone who had even more experience and could come and teach them Latin and could teach them how to play music. And so these things, like the home studies that the governess would teach you, they would be the things that then you see the proficient women being very good at. And you see that on display at the party when Jane and Emma are both asked to play the piano. And so these were things that every young lady would have been expected to do. They would be able to draw, they would be able to play the piano, they would know how to read French, and they would know the other basics that their governors had taught them. And this was a marker of society. And so there were just a lot of complex variables at play with British society at the time that are interesting backgrounds to understand kind of what's going on here. And so what's interesting about Jane, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, Jane Fairfax, is she had all these markers of high society, and yet it was kind of closed to her, except for this one secret option, which is the big joke of the book. And then you have those like Miss Bates and Harriet. They're playing, I think Jane Austen is really playing with ideas of nature there. Like some people are just meant to be in those spheres, which then makes you retrogressively, I think, go back and think about people like Lady Catherine, right? I think Jane very well could have been saying that even there, you have some people who by nature should never have been a lady.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Lady Catherine probably deserved to be in the peasant class and just by birth happened to be a lady.
In this novel, of course, the villainess of the novel, Mrs. Elton.
Yeah, she just got there because Mr. Elton's a big idiot.
A big idiot.
Well, and she never actually understands where she fits. She thinks so. Her perspective of herself is so skewed. So if you look at, it's clear and it's established by Austen that she's well below Emma in terms of where she fits class-wise, but she has no perception of it.
Yeah, and so Austen, a lot like Tolstoy, has this keen mind where she's able to see the reality of the social fabric she's a part of and bring out its benefits, bring out and parody its evils in ways that are clever and, I think, insightful. Because she comes to some interesting conclusions that I think that people who try to simplify it and say that she was bemoaning the fate of women.
Secretly subverting the class.
Yeah, you really don't see any of that.
No, you really don't.
Right, and you also don't see her really bemoaning the social structure. What you see her bemoaning is the stupidity of people who don't understand
their station, their place, their lot in life.
And that it really is more of a play. And so Mr. Knightley understands his position.
Right.
Yep.
And he takes it seriously.
He sees himself in a position of responsibility, and he then requires that same level of responsibility of Emma.
Yeah.
And that's, one of the great scenes of the book is when
the great scene of the book, and a possible candidate for the greatest scene of this year when we get to our redux, I would say.
Yeah. And so, I think Knightley is a good example of seeing the kind of attitude she admired in this particular, I don't want to say it again, society. Mm-hmm. I don't want to say social fabric again, even though I just said it again. That he understands his position. He takes his position seriously with responsibility, and yet he doesn't lord it over. I think he actually sees Mr. Martin as an equal. He doesn't see him as inferior to himself, except that he wasn't born to have his title.
He's not all
but he respects Mr. Martin.
I'm going to elevate him. I have to. It's just
no, yeah. He has none of this.
But we're both,
exactly. He has none of the silly immaturity.
We have different roles in life. My responsibility is to help out people like Mr. Martin.
Exactly.
So I respect him. I have a high regard for him. He belongs at the top of his class.
And he deserves responsibility, and you can rely on this man.
He can be trusted.
But you're not going to nominate him for the House of Lords.
Right.
Right.
He's not made for it.
Right. Which is, if he was Emma, he would have tried to do something stupid like that.
Right.
And so I think that this book, if we're just wanting to put a plug in for why young men should read it, it's really helpful for a young man to understand early on that overreaching is just stupid. You learn responsibility and let other men around you as you work help you see what your role in life is. And then don't get bitter about it and just do the work you've been given to do. Because a lot of times other men are going to have more perceptiveness about it than you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, do you have anything else you wanted to?
No.
I have some fun notes from the memoir of Jane Austen by Jane Austen Leigh, her nephew, which was published in 1869. And they say it's one of the primary sources of Austen's popularity, actually, that the elites read her before this, but her nephew and her family kind of realized that people were taking some notice of her. So they said, oh, we've got to, get a biography together before everyone that remembers her died. This was after her beloved sister, Cassandra, was already dead and had already burned a lot of their correspondence. And there's the mysterious letters that we'll never know because Cassandra didn't want us to see them. What dark secrets did Jane Austen have? But her nephew wrote a very glowing memoir of her, which is responsible for a lot of how people understood her until the 20th century, really, when modern critics decided that she was a feminist. Proto-feminist, proto-socialist, someone subverting, someone that hated every one of her characters. People decided that they knew better than... And the thing about her nephew is that everybody says that he just wrote the biography to kind of whitewash it, and because he was so close to her, because he was a member of the family, therefore he couldn't have actually told the truth, which I just think that logic is so backwards.
Makes so much sense.
So backward. Yeah, some modern 20th century psychiatrist can obviously tell us more about Jane Austen than the person who actually knew her.
It wouldn't make any sense for us to write Jake's biography.
No.
We would need to go...
We're biased.
We need to
we
go
love
find...
Jake, so we can't write his biography.
Yeah, we need to go find
some guy on Twitter.
Or an academic over at the university or something who
300
would really...
years in the future.
Right.
Yeah, who would really understand Jake's motives.
Right, and be able to read between the lines and find all the things that Jake was discontent about that he didn't want to actually mention in his letters. And there was those emails I deleted of Jake. Well, obviously, that was where he revealed the great love affair that he had that I didn't want the world to... I didn't want the world to know about because it would tarnish his character.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is that everyone is dumb that's not on the Bookening, except for James Austen Leigh.
And you, dear listener.
And you dear
yes,
listener.
you, dear.
I should say everyone's dumb that is not on the Bookening, listens to the Bookening, or...
Likes and follows Warhorn Media.
Likes and follows warhornmedia.com on the various social media platforms on which we are so wonderfully engaged. But James Austen Leigh's memoir, published in 1869, has some really fun stuff I thought I'd just bring in. This is a note about Jane Austen that I thought was kind of fun. Just kind of makes you like her. Although I'm sure James Austen Leigh is lying about it to make us like her because he's biased, because he actually knew her and loved her. Quote, she said that she thought it quite fair to note peculiarities and weaknesses, but that it was her desire to create, not to reproduce. So when people asked her if her characters were based on anything, she would just say, no, I'd rather create than produce. Quote, I am too proud of my gentlemen to admit that they were only Mr. A or Colonel B. She did not, however, suppose that her imaginary characters were of a higher order than are to be found in nature. For she said, when speaking of her two great favorites, Edmund Bertram and Mr. Knightley, they are very far from being what I know English gentlemen often are. So she actually, as great as Mr. Knightley is and as ideal of a hero as he is, she actually was enough of an optimist and not cynic to say there's English gentlemen out there that are even better than Mr. Knightley. And then another fun quote that I just thought illuminated a little bit of Austen's personality. She certainly took a kind of parental interest in the beings whom she created and did not dismiss them from her thoughts when she finished her last chapter. We have seen in one of her letters her personal affection for Darcy and Elizabeth, and when sending a copy of Emma to a friend whose daughter had been lately born, she wrote thus, I trust you will be as glad to see my Emma as I shall be to see your Jemima. She was very fond of Emma, but did not reckon on her being a general favorite. For when commencing the work, she said, I am going to take a heroine who no one but myself will much like. She would, if asked, tell us many little particulars about the subsequent career of some of the people. In this way, we learned that Miss Steele never succeeded in catching the doctor, that Kitty Bennet was satisfactory. We're actually going to get some follow-up, guys, on what happened to the Pride and Prejudice. Are you ready for this?
Oh, yeah.
It's like Dumbledore is gay, and
boy.
Hopefully she does a better job of telling us what happens than J.K. Rowling has. Harry
Mr.
Potter
Bennett
slam.
killed himself.
Mr. Potter. No, actually, I think it turned out pretty well. Let's see here. Kitty Bennett was satisfactorily married to the clergyman near Pemberley, while Mary obtained nothing higher than one of her Uncle Philip's clerks, and was content to be considered a star in the Society of Meryton. Let's see, there's some stuff about books that we haven't read yet. But we do find out about Emma that Mr. Woodhouse survived his daughter's marriage and kept her and Mr. Knightley from settling at Donwell about 2 years, and that the letter placed by Frank Churchill before Jane Fairfax, which she swept away unread, which we did never find out what that letter said, but we know that Jane Austen knew, and it just simply contained the word pardon. So there you go.
Sweet.
Yeah, she loved her characters. She treated them like kids.
That is something you see with a lot of the really great authors, is that their characters take on a life even outside the novels. So Dickens would always talk about his characters and how
There are other exploits that he didn't have time to write down.
They continue to live outside his books.
Yeah,
So-
I think that's fun that you could, if Jane Austen was alive today, you could be like, well, how did Darcy and Lizzie get on? And she'd be able to tell you how many kids they had and all that kind of stuff. I know, was that?
About death at Pemberley.
Death at Pemberley.
I
Yes.
thought that
Mysteries that
Agatha
they
Christie
solved.
already told us that. Or
PD.
was it P.D. James?
P.D. James, yeah,
Okay.
it was P.D. James. So I thought, and I just liked to see that Mr. Knightley was, in fact, her favorite gentleman. She clearly had a type, and I think Mr. Knightley is it. So if you want to know how you could have attracted Jane Austen, if you're me and you're planning on building a time machine and going back and doing just that, then you need to be like Mr. Knightley. But I think that ends our...
Start the Rocky training montage.
All right, Jake, what's Emma about? What's the, can you just... Brandon's wife told us we have to recap the novel, folks. So,
Well, she's seen this movie.
oh, she's seen the movie?
No, we don't have to recap.
We don't have to recap. Well, can you do it? Can you recap it in 3 sentences?
Class, condescension, and maturation. How's that? 3 words.
3 words? I wish they were all C's. Class, condensation.
Condensation. Yes, condensation is
Class, condensation.
the two sides. So class, what we've talked about already a little bit. Condescension, the two sides of it. There are 2 sides of condescension presented, and I'm sure you're itching to talk about it probably later. But there's Emma's condescending behavior, which I mean pejoratively.
The way that we mostly use the word
way that we mostly
condescending.
use it today. And then there's Mr. Knightley's noble condescension. And then maturity, we see Emma mature.
Yes, this is one of
Over the
Brandon's
course,
buildings roman.
It's the closest thing that I've seen so far to a real coming of age type of
in our novels. I mean, you could argue for
Huck, maybe.
You could argue for Huck. You could
Not
argue for
really.
East of Eden. At least it has a coming of age section with Cal and Aaron.
Yeah.
And you could argue for Pride and Prejudice with Lizzie and Darcy to a certain extent. Maybe.
But that's less coming of age and more of I was an idiot and didn't see it. It's not Lizzie gets humbled.
Right.
Emma matures.
Right.
And there's a distinction there. And of course, Emma has to be humbled in order to mature, but there's something else going on with Emma that I don't think is going on so much with Lizzie.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. So this is our first true coming of age novel. And what we have to decide, fellas, I'm just going to throw out this, what's the word? Cliffhanger for the listener. At the end of our discussion, we are going to decide whether Emma Woodhouse belongs in our League of Monsters.
Uh-oh.
But we have to get through our whole discussion first.
What are you going to say? I think I know what I'm going to say.
I think I know what I'm going to say.
And we are talking specifically about Emma Woodhouse and not Emma Knightley, I suppose. Although we can argue that when we get there, how those two characters interact with each other and what they teach us about each other.
We should also just say, are there any other candidates from this book?
Well, Twitter wanted us to decide whether Mr. Woodhouse was a monster.
Oh, we should save that to the end, too.
Say that for at the end.
Somebody asked that.
Yeah. Eric Wilson. Shout out to Eric Wilson. He wants to know.
Is Mr. Woodhouse a monster?
Also, shout out to...
Joe Banks.
Well, yeah, shout out to Joe Banks. He's awesome. Oh, here it is. Shout out to Christopher Davey. But Christopher, thank you for listening, and thank you for agreeing with us after telling us we suck. Oh, and we also, guys, shout out to Kara Wigner, Kara Hobbs, who's listening to this. She said she will stop listening if we nominate Emma to our Monster Squad.
Oh, boy.
So... Okay, let's talk about Emma. We're not going to decide whether she's a monster yet, but let's just talk this gal through after Jake dies. Let's just start with Emma at the beginning of the novel. Is she just
A monster?
is she just a terrible person?
I'll tell you that I don't know that I've had so much difficulty starting and getting into a novel that we have read for this show as I have with Emma, because I simply did not like Emma. It was just obnoxious to me. For probably the first 6 to 8 chapters was just, I didn't want to read because I didn't like Emma. I didn't care about Emma. And I was frustrated with Austen for not giving me something to like or a reason to keep reading. That's how I felt for probably the first 6 to 8 chapters of the book. So yes, no, Emma is not likable at the beginning of the novel. How's that?
There you go.
Answered.
That's the answer.
Brandon?
Yeah, she's not likable. She's pretty quickly established, and Jane Austen herself admitted that she's hard to like, right?
Well,
yeah, that quote that you read was validating.
Yes.
It was like, yes, you succeeded. You wrote a character that I did not like, and you meant to do it. That makes me feel great.
Yeah, and so she's a spoiled brat. She's only been told good things by a father who himself is just full of self-pity and anxiety and neuroses. She has had a governess who she's always felt superior to and has largely babied. And so, of course, she's become who she is at the beginning of the novel, which is this girl who thinks that she can make any fantasy reality and direct her life as she chooses.
So self-satisfied in her perceptions of the world and her ability to just maneuver people into marriage and into classes. And
the only thing that gives me pause and makes me think that there has to be some virtue with her at the beginning is the fact that we know that Mr. Knightley has loved her for so long.
Yeah. Well, what we understand about Mr. Knightley is that he has a wisdom about him that's just, he sees, he knows, he sees. What are you laughing about?
He loves 13-year-old girls.
Also, he loves 13-year-old girls.
We'll get to that. We're not going to be able to leave that undiscussed.
He was 29 at the time. They're 16 years apart.
Yeah.
So, but he saw who Emma could become.
Yeah.
And he was patient, and he watched, and he waited, and he did his best to shepherd her into maturity from a distance.
And that's actually, pointing that out is, again, back to my point about her doing these subtle parallels. Right there, Mr. Knightley does with her what she should have done with everyone else.
That's right.
So...
What do you mean?
Like you said, he shepherds her into maturity and waits patiently instead of pushing her into unrealistic.
He was condescending to her, understanding of her frame, understanding of where she was in life, understanding her true potential, and therefore, we get that discussion at the end of the book of, I probably should have just stayed a little more hands off. I probably shouldn't have been so. I probably could have let you go, but I've kept feeling the need to step in and be the guy who disciplined you and tried to bring sense to you.
Well, I think it speaks well of Mr. Knightley somehow that he really wasn't planning on asking her to marry him. He always had this kind of attraction, but, he realized it's just at the very last minute when she, he's gone on this trip and she says this thing and it just kind of gets dragged out of him that, why don't you marry me? It's not.
No, it's how it happens.
You guys are both looking at me like I'm crazy. No. Did we read the same novel?
He says as much that he wasn't planning on making the proposal.
I don't know how much we need to spend of this podcast mitigating any sort of creep factor, but I think that helps with the creep factor that he wasn't like, I'm just going to wait until Emma grows up and see whether she turns out okay, and then I'll marry that.
I'll marry that.
I'm grooming her.
Right, I'm grooming her, yeah.
No, it's not what's going on.
No, he's actually like, this is a girl he's known since childhood. He's always been something of a father figure to her, but then part of him was like, maybe.
Always presented as a brother, though.
Yeah. Yeah, and they're very much equals in mind and temperament. They're able to do the witty banter with each other. They, in a similar way to Lizzie and Darcy, you feel that meeting of minds that, there's no other two people in the novel that could possibly, maybe Frank Churchill is like kind of a facsimile of that kind of thing, but they belong together just from that sort of romantic comedy. They were made for each other kind of feeling is in there, I think. But yeah, Jane Austen straight up tells us in the very first page of this novel, the real evils indeed of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much of her own way and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. These were the disadvantage which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her.
Yeah, it perfectly sums her up.
Yeah.
Yep. She tells us exactly what we're dealing with. And it's hard to deal with at first. And it wasn't like, for me, it wasn't, I don't have the patience for people like this. It's just, I didn't have the patience it was hard to have the patience for that first 6 to 8 chapters of just her Austen showing us over and over again how, yep, this is just what Emma's like. Yep, this is just what Emma's like. Yep, this is just what Emma. Okay.
Yeah, and when you know that she's the main character, and that's what you get to deal with for the rest of this novel.
Yeah, it's a little disheartening at first.
Oh boy.
And Mr. Knightley shows up and he's like, yep, she's just like Austen said she was at the very beginning. Let me give you a nice monologue summarizing everything that's going on and everything we're showing you about her.
Emma, you're terrible and you should change. And she's like, I'm not going to change.
But when it starts to become endearing to me is when you start to see Austen's hand in guiding Emma, and you see how tongue-in-cheek Austen is in handling Emma. It becomes very funny and comical.
Yes.
And then that's when it starts to get fun, is once you see that you're supposed to see everything that's going on with Emma and everything that Emma's doing actually is really funny. Like she doesn't see anything.
Which is largely when Harriet comes into the story.
Yeah, that's right.
And then it becomes like a early Frankenstein story.
Where the monster's like dying and mangled on the table.
Yeah.
I think for me, the novel, I mean, obviously I've gone on record as Jane Austen being one of my favorite novelists, and this is one of her great works, but it really is kind of a slog until I would go so far as to say until Mr. Elton proposes is when it really gets fun and starts to be funny, because you start to be able to finally get the sort of God's eye view and be able to maintain a ironic distance and see the cracks in the walls that Emma's built up, and that's when it gets fun.
Once I would say, right around the time of the painting.
Yes.
When you start to see, okay, she has no idea that she is wooing Mr. Elton and feeding him, and he is in love with her, and he's going to propose to her. You just start to wait for it.
Yeah.
And everything from that moment just becomes comical, because here she is unwittingly feeding his hopes. And it's just, I think you're right.
I guess I should ask two things. First of all, do you think that most people listening to this will agree with us that Emma's an obnoxious character? Or are we like a patriarchal jerks?
I think that if you don't understand Emma to be obnoxious, especially at the beginning, then you don't understand the book. You don't understand Emma's journey. You can't appreciate Emma's resolution. Mm-hmm. The whole point of driving home how obnoxious Emma is to make it awesome when Emma's redeemed and Emma matures and grows up. So if you're unwilling to see that, then you don't get it, and you don't deserve to consider Emma to be a favorite book of yours.
Yeah,
you
probably should be worried about your personality.
Yeah, no kidding. Like if you can't see Emma's flaws, then I don't know, man. If Emma's not a little annoying to you, like, I don't know. I think you have to treat Emma at the beginning of the book the way that Knightley tells Emma she should have treated Miss Bates. That, it's
what is good and what is foolish. Or
she's like, Emma has that thing of, well, you have to admit that she's very foolish, and it's so ridiculous. Like, it couldn't help but say it. Like, you have to have that approach with Emma that, she's that foolish and that ridiculous from the beginning. But you have to be able to sit back and watch and wait and remember what I had to keep reminding myself is, remember, you're dealing with a 21-year-old girl here. Yeah. And remember your college students, Jake, when you were a college pastor. Because when I encounter, having been set up by Pride and Prejudice and having come to Emma, not having read Emma or having watched any Emma movies, which I still haven't, I expect an Austen heroine to be, awesome, to be ahead of me, to be like, wow, I was expecting, okay, Emma's going to be some kind of like every man's dream girl or something like that. And so remember, she's 21. The book is obviously about how she has to be humbled and has to mature.
Which in some ways, I think, makes us a candidate for being a more mature novel than Pride and Prejudice. Because the characters in Pride and Prejudice, while they're great, are a little less realistic in their age. Because, she and Lizzie are about the same age.
Right. Exactly the same age. Lizzie might be 20 instead of 21.
Right.
And so, as great as
Lizzie is so far ahead of Emma.
Yeah.
Right.
Which...
It happens.
Yeah, fair enough.
Well, Emma was spoiled and Lizzie wasn't.
Yeah.
Lizzie had reason to be... Lizzie was required to mature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you can look at Emma and you can take her natural gifts and abilities and you could stick her in the Bennett family and imagine her being a Lizzie type figure pretty easily, I think. And you could take Lizzie and put her in a place where she doesn't have her sisters or her mother or Donald Sutherland as her father. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's really easy to like Pride and Prejudice a lot more than this novel because the romance is much more sweeping and you just like Lizzie and Darcy. But I agree with Brandon. In some ways, I think this is a mature work. I mean, it's certainly more of a satirical comedy. It's a little bit more ironic than Pride and Prejudice was, I think.
Way more tongue-in-cheek.
Way more tongue-in-cheek. And so you have to approach it on that level if you're expecting the same sort of like romance that you felt in your bosom as you read scenes in Pride and Prejudice. You're not going to get so much of that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what I think. I like Mr. Knightley. That's what I think.
Well, Knightley's a much more three-dimensional hero, I think, than Darcy.
Yes, that's true.
Darcy, in some senses, I think we said in our Pride and Prejudice podcast, is Batman. I mean, he's just like, he's got all the wealth. He saves the girl. He does everything.
And he's always, he's not a character that you're dealing with. He's always dealt with at a distance until he kind of comes in the end. And, you find out how awesome he actually is after all.
Yeah, and you see Mr. Knightley and you see his flaws. He's moody. He's not the he's not.
He can almost sulk a little bit.
Yeah.
Or,
I mean, you see his traits like magnified in his brother, but he has some of the same stuff. He'd rather not be at parties. He's
not going to dance if he is, unless he has a good reason to.
Yeah. And then that's where you see his virtues start to come out too.
Yeah. He's not going to be moved to dance or participate. He'd rather be by himself until his compassion moves him.
Yeah. So he's principled, which is a virtue she admires. But his principles also.
His principles overcome his personality,
I guess he's quite a bit
which is something that I think that she especially admires in a man.
I think Jane Austen would have liked Levin.
Yeah, I think so too.
Levin at his maturest, perhaps.
Yeah. But he's got some similar qualities to Levin.
Yeah, I mean, he's real. I mean, what Jane Austen seems to not like in a man, or at least to find very suspect, is that Frank Churchill quality of sort of, even though Jane Austen's great with the jokes and the banter, and Emma and Knightley have plenty of them, there's something not serious, some lack of weight in someone like Churchill, or someone even worse like Wickham.
Part of the gravity of her heroes is that they are always under-promising and over-delivering, and her villains are always over-promising and under-delivering. They're flashy, they come out with a bang, and they're impressive, and it turns out that there's not much more to them than the flash and bang, and there's a little more to Frank Churchill than flash and bang, and she'll give him that, but she really wants to contrast him with somebody who's the iceberg,
Yeah.
There's always much more underneath the surface. That's the kind of man that she likes to set up, the iceberg.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think she likes principled men, and I think she'd probably be... I think we could allow for Darcy or Knightley to be a little stodgy or a little, quick to judge.
Well, I think she likes a Bingley type too, but I think part of it may just be that she finds it easy to demonstrate the virtue of a principled man by giving him kind of character and personality flaws that he has to work to overcome in order to embrace his principles. So she's going to take a guy who is naturally antisocial and put him at a dance and make him have to dance with Harriet as a principle of caring for this woman.
Yeah.
So here's his character and his personality. Here's a situation that's antithetical to his personality, and watch him overcome himself.
Yep.
And she likes to do that kind of thing a lot. Mr. Bingley might have danced with Harriet anyway without ever thinking about it, because he's just a sweet, gregarious guy, and you don't see his principles at work in something like that.
But you get the impression with someone like Frank Churchill that his principles should have helped him overcome his situation in a way that they didn't somehow.
That's right.
Yeah, so there's a flaw with Frank Churchill that there's not with
Mr. Knightley.
Mr. Knightley or Darcy.
Or Darcy, yeah.
Yeah.
Breeding in class starts with principles.
Yes.
Not with the flourishes, not with the heirs of class.
And I think Jane Austen had a really good grasp on what the virtues of being a man and the virtues of being a woman were, or are. It's like you said, that directness, that taking responsibility, taking the initiative to overcome your stupid self and just go do what should be done.
And he doesn't
to have self-control.
He doesn't seem to have trouble with it, actually.
No, Knightley's just a dude. I mean,
He's just awesome.
Yeah.
You know, Miss Bates is going to be insulted, so he's going to take care of her. But Harriet's going to be slighted, so he's going to take care of her. Yeah. And he's going to shame everybody else.
Yeah,
he does it. And he's not going to bat an eye about it.
And that scene, and also the scene where he calls up the carriage for Miss Bates.
Yeah.
And all that, I think it does the work that the whole helping the Bennets with their tragedy does for Darcy.
Yeah.
Which is another point, I think, just about the difference, I guess, in the art that's going on. Like you said, Pride and Prejudice is more sweeping, and Emma is more, it's toned down.
Yeah.
So we keep going. I might convince myself I like Emma better.
I think I kind of do, but I'm not sure. Maybe we'll save that. I don't know.
I might. I certainly, and this may speak more of just the way my life is right now. If I'm going to pick up one of the two of them again, I'm probably going to pick up Pride and Prejudice, but that's not because I don't think that has anything to do with my value of the story. And it has more to do with just my desire for something easy.
Right.
Pride and Prejudice is easy.
The setups and payoffs just simply take longer in Emma, and there's less immediate gratification, which makes it a more difficult novel. But
in Pride and Prejudice, you're getting gratification all along the way.
Like the first chapter, you've got 2 or 3 hilarious lines, and Mr. Bennet's funny. And
yeah, it's a nice comedy. It pulls you through it. It's got its painful scenes and moments.
Well, I guess we're talking about Mr. Knightley now. I realized we never did our, what's that thing?
Baggage check.
We never talked about our baggage check.
With horror, our heroes realized they had never completed their baggage check. Would there be time to complete it before the episode came to an end? No, there wouldn't be.
Welcome to the Bookening. Actually, this is not the introduction. This is the end. And so I'm going to tell you that I, like Jane Austen was the author of Emma, I'm kind of like that. I'm the author of this podcast. And just like Emma and Mr. Knightley were 2 wonderful characters in the novel, Jacob Menzel and Brandon Chastain are 2 wonderful characters that I created.
Who were fictions created by and masterminded by, guided by the providential hand of Nathan Alberson.
Nathan Aaron Alberson.
It'd be a twist. It's a Shyamalan like twist. This has all just been Nathan talking.
Yep.
It's all actually happening in his head. You're not actually listening to this. You too are one of the characters.
It's all happening in my head. Well, that's not true, folks. I'm not actually doing the voices of Jake Menzel or Brandon Chastain. We hired actors to do that. I wrote the script. We all act like it's improvised. It's pretty amazing what I do on a weekly basis for this podcast. And if you want to enjoy more things that I have influence over, go to warhornmedia.com. Go to Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter and look up Warhorn Media at Warhorn Media on all 3 of those wonderful social media services. You can also find me on Twitter as @NotFamousNathan. You can find Jacob Menzel, who I will now reveal in a twist on the twist is real. Or maybe I just maintain his
Twitter account, Facebook account.
Yeah, maybe I just maintain him on the handsomest picture I could. Put it on there. Brandon Chastain is also here. He performs on the Bookening. We're glad to have him.
Nathan's alarm starts sounding and he wakes up.